Dawn, Saipan, 1944. Diesel engines growl in the dark as Japanese Type 95 tanks roll toward marine lines, crews certain their armor will hold. Then the tracers arrive. Browning .50 caliber fire rips through thin steel like paper, punching clean holes, freezing engines, and shattering confidence. Minutes later, U.S. Shermans join the fight, and the battle becomes a slaughter. This is how a tank built for the 1930s met the industrial hammer of World War II, and how bullets, not shells, exposed the myth of invincibility. Make sure to subscribe for more forgotten moments of war history. When Japan began modernizing its armored forces in the early 1930s, commanders believed they saw the future. Their infantry support Type 89 tank was slow, lumbering, and barely able to keep up with advancing troops. Mobility was becoming the currency of modern warfare, and the Imperial Army feared being left behind. To them, speed was armor, and maneuver was survival. So, in 1933, a team of engineers inside Mitsubishi were ordered to create something radically different. A machine that could sprint across rough terrain, support fast attacks, and be built in numbers the nation could realistically produce. It didn't need to duel heavy tanks. It just needed to outrun, outmaneuver, and overwhelm. What emerged was a compact vehicle barely 7 tons, with a thin shell of steel and a 37mm main gun. Tests in Manchuria shocked observers. The little machine darted through mud, bounced over rocks, and climbed slopes that other armored designs would have feared. It used an air-cooled diesel engine, something few nations experimented with, which lowered the chance of catastrophic fires. It was so efficient on fuel that it could run nearly 10 hours on internal tanks alone. For the Empire's planners, the speed, range, and reliability felt revolutionary. Early issues, like the violent rocking motion of the suspension, were addressed with braces and modified springs. The rough ride never vanished, but the machine performed so well everywhere else that commanders accepted the compromise. The Army Technical Bureau worried the armor was far too thin, but cavalry officers pushed back. Mobility mattered more than thickness. They believed that on sprawling battlefields against infantry with weak anti-armor weapons, the tank's speed would keep it alive. After tense debate, the design was approved. When production began in 1936, Japanese officers felt they'd caught the future by the tail. It was light, affordable, easy to maintain, and, most importantly, deployable almost anywhere across the Empire's growing territory. Tank crews trained inside its cramped interior until the confines felt normal. Radios were scarce, but signaling flags and hand gestures were considered good enough. After all, in every early fight, it seemed unstoppable. And that early confidence would become a trap. When war ignited across China in 1937, Japan finally unleashed its new light armored weapon. Against Chinese forces lacking meaningful anti-tank weapons, the vehicle seemed unstoppable. Its 37mm gun blasted apart sandbag nests and brick walls. Its machine guns shredded enemy infantry. When infantry units advanced, these tanks darted ahead, exploiting every breakthrough and tearing through ambushes that would have stalled slower machines. Crews began to believe their armor was not just adequate, it was superior. Victories rolled in and praise flowed. Commanders noted how the tank crossed ground that horses and trucks refused, and how its diesel engine shrugged off battlefield abuse. Maintenance crews worked in small pits with basic tools, yet kept most of the fleet running. For a military obsessed with momentum, this little tank became a symbol of Japanese mechanized power. Officers repeated a comforting myth: speed keeps you alive. Armor only slows you down. Then came 1939, and the border clash against the Soviet Union at Khalkhin Gol. Here, Japanese tankers met opponents with real armor and heavier weapons. Soviet BT series tanks, fast, well-armed, and crewed by hardened veterans, hit back with 45mm guns. Japanese crews discovered something they had never experienced. Their shells bounced, their armor cracked, their engines were pierced. Color drained from the battlefield romance. Japan lost dozens of tanks, and careful observers realized they had entered a different class of warfare entirely. But Japanese leadership filtered the lesson through denial. Rather than redesign the machine, they blamed tactics, terrain, and training. The tank remained unchanged. Why invest in something bigger, heavier, or more complex when the empire planned to dominate jungles, islands, and narrow roads? When the next campaigns opened in Malaya and the Philippines, the illusion returned. Their light tanks shocked Allied commanders. Slipping through vegetation, British generals thought impassable and reinforcing the myth that mobility was invincibility. Tank crews rode this confidence like a wave. Their machines had always delivered. Their commanders praised the results. The battlefield, so far, had agreed. Yet, with every comfortable victory, Japan drifted further away from the industrial realities of World War II. They were preparing to fight the war they wanted, not the one they were actually heading toward. And on one volcanic island in 1944, that illusion would finally shatter. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had changed. Japan's sweeping offensives were gone, replaced by desperate defenses on shrinking territory. When American planners selected Saipan, a volcanic island in the Marianas, Tokyo understood the stakes instantly. If the United States seized it, long-range bombers would be able to strike Japan's mainland for the first time. Losing Saipan meant opening the gates to fire. The island bristled with defenders. Nearly 30,000 Japanese troops dug into ridges, caves, and ravines. Among them sat Colonel Takashi Goto's tank regiment, 40-plus armored vehicles, including light Type 95s and slightly heavier Type 97s. In Japanese eyes, this was a formidable armored force for island warfare. Many tankers were experienced veterans. Crews trusted their machines, believing the terrain and night fighting would give them an edge. On June 15, 1944, the first American waves slammed ashore. The beaches shook with artillery, mortar fire, and machine gun bursts. Marines inched inland under smoke and shrapnel, dragging radios, flamethrowers, and ammunition crates through sand already stained red. Behind the beaches, landing ships unloaded supplies at breakneck speed. Soon, the unmistakable silhouettes of M4 Sherman tanks rolled off LST ramps, bigger, thicker, and more modern than anything Japan had on the island. Japanese commanders watched from the high ground and felt pressure turn to panic. The invasion wasn't a probing attack. It was the beginning of the Marianas Campaign, a direct assault on Japan's defensive line. If the Americans solidified their beachhead, pushing them off would become impossible. So Japanese leadership issued a chilling order, a counterattack before sunrise. Tank crews tightened their harnesses. Infantry units prepared to ride on hulls and cling to armor plates. Diesel engines coughed to life. The thin steel hulls vibrated. They planned to smash through the American lines in one sudden thrust. Overwhelming shock, confusion, and speed. Night would be their shield. Momentum would be their weapon. But unseen beyond the darkness, Marine machine gun teams were already digging in. Sherman crews slept beside their tanks, ready to mount instantly at the first trace of engine rumble. Anti-tank gunners inspected firing pins and checked shell crates. .30 caliber barrels gleamed. .50 caliber ammo belts glinted like copper snakes under dim lanterns. Both sides knew dawn would be bloody, but only one side understood what modern firepower could do to thin armor. Japan was about to learn the difference. Just before dawn on June 17, 1944, the jungle around Saipan trembled beneath a rising growl. Diesel engines revved, treads clattered over broken coral, and in the darkness, 44 Japanese tanks, Type 95s and heavier Type 97s, formed into columns beneath barking commanders. Crews believed this was their chance to shove the Americans back into the sea. They had done it to other enemies. Why not here? Inside each cramped turret, commanders stood. No seats, no comfort, sweat dripping as they hunched over periscopes. Drivers nudged steering levers, blind except for slits in steel. Gunners loaded 37mm shells into breeches, adrenaline masking the fear of what waited ahead. Behind them, infantry clung to hulls, knuckles white, hoping these tanks would shield them from American fire. They moved out. The dark ridges echoed with the mechanical heartbeat of the assault. Tank commanders whispered orders down into steel coffins, barely big enough for 3 men. Few radios existed, so flags and shouted signals guided movement, archaic in a war dominated by modern communication. But spirits were high. Tanks had crushed foes before. Confidence was fuel. Out ahead, Marine sentries stiffened. They heard what sounded like thunder rolling closer, a chorus of engines and tracks grinding rock. Orders flew across foxholes. Browning machine guns were swung toward the noise. Anti-tank crews yanked tarps off their weapons. Sherman crews tumbled into their turrets, starting engines that coughed to life with a roar. Then muzzle flashes lit the horizon as Japanese tanks opened fire first. Tracer streaks ripping across the fields, machine guns stitching flames through brush. Infantry leapt from tank hulls, sprinting behind their armored spearheads. It was sudden, terrifying momentum. But as the tanks closed within 200 yards, something happened no Japanese tanker was prepared for. Marine heavy machine gunners squeezed triggers on the Browning M 2.50 caliber, its deep thunder rolling like artillery. Armor-piercing rounds slammed into the Type 95's paper-thin steel. Sparks burst through vision slits. Some rounds punched through both sides of hulls, like hot knives through tin. Tankers screamed as bullets ricocheted inside, turning compartments into blenders of steel fragments. Commanders ducked, but there was nowhere to hide. One tank jerked sideways, engine coughing black smoke, hit through the rear vents. Marines watched in disbelief as their machine guns, infantry weapons, disabled armor. The battlefield shifted instantly. Japanese momentum faltered. Some tanks hesitated, unsure whether to push forward or pull back. Infantry scattered, suddenly exposed. Commanders stood in turrets, waving frantic signals in the dark, until a .50 caliber round punched through a helmet and dropped them like falling boards. It wasn't courage that failed, it was physics. The armor designed for China's battlefields couldn't withstand America's industrial killing tools. Panic spread through the ranks. Some tanks veered, others stalled. Marines continued hammering them, tracers dancing across steel skins never meant for such punishment. The illusion shattered in seconds. For the first time, Japanese tank crews realized their armor didn't just have weaknesses, it was fatally outdated. On this night, they weren't unstoppable spearheads. They were targets. As the night attack devolved into chaos, another sound rolled across the battlefield. Heavy engines, deeper, angrier. United States M4. Sherman tanks lumbered forward through smoke and darkness, guided by spotters and the flicker of burning brush. To Marines pinned in foxholes, the Shermans felt like steel giants. To Japanese tankers, they were something worse: executioners. The contrast was immediate. Where a Type 95 weighed barely 8 tons, a Sherman weighed nearly 30. Its armor, angled, reinforced, thick, shrugged off the same 37mm shells the Japanese fired in desperation. When the first Type 95 crew lined up their cannon and let the round fly, it bounced harmlessly off a Sherman's turret front with a metallic clang. And nothing else. Inside the American tank, the crew barely noticed. Shermans returned fire with 75mm shells, each round a hammer of industrial warfare. When the first Japanese tank was struck, the explosion ripped its turret clean off, sending it sailing into the air before crashing down in flames. The shockwave rippled through the attacking column. Japanese commanders saw it happen and knew instantly they were facing something their doctrine had never prepared them for. Machine gun teams riding atop Shermans added insult to injury, pouring .50 caliber rounds into hull plates, already cracking under the pressure. Tracers stitched through engine vents, cooking diesel fuel inside until tanks belched flames. Some tanks ground to a halt, disabled, then ignited as ammunition inside detonated like fireworks. The M4's radios made the advantage even worse. Tank commanders didn't shout or wave flags. They coordinated like chess pieces, shifting flanks, cutting off escape routes, calling supporting artillery without exposing themselves. Japanese crews, blind in the night, could only guess where their allies were. Infantry who had clung to the hulls now fled in panic. Those who tried to hide behind tanks found themselves silhouetted by flames and shredded by American fire. Marines vaulted from foxholes, tossing grenades beneath idling tracks, turning bogies into twisted metal anchors. One Sherman plowed directly into a cargo, pushing the smaller tank backward across the dirt like a child's toy. Its tracks spun helplessly, unable to resist the weight pressing it down. A shell fired point-blank ended it, ripping through both sides like tissue. Inside surviving Japanese tanks, morale collapsed. Shell casings clattered across floors. Smoke seeped through hatches. Commands devolved into frantic shouts. Radios failed. Periscopes fogged with heat. Crews hammered at jammed escape hatches as steel shrieked under impact. Some abandoned their tanks altogether, leaping into the dark only to be cut down by waiting riflemen. By sunrise, the ground was littered with burned hulls, some blackened, some still glowing red. The Shermans idled triumphantly, barrels steaming, crews exhausted but alive. For Japanese tank crews, this battle delivered a brutal truth. They had not been fighting on equal terms. Their armor, doctrine, and weapons belonged to another decade. In the face of American steel, they were outmatched, outgunned, and tragically outbuilt. The Industrial Revolution had arrived on Saipan, and it had teeth. When the smoke cleared and Saipan's beaches stopped glowing with burning fuel, the battlefield fell eerily silent. But inside the minds of the surviving Japanese tank crews, something far louder had begun: the collapse of belief. For years, training manuals and instructors had assured them their light armor was enough. Combat in China had reinforced the illusion. But now, as they stared at hulls chewed open by machine gun fire, that confidence dissolved into disbelief. Tank crews retrieved twisted armor plates, studying the fist-sized holes punched clean through. They ran their fingers along the jagged edges, tracing the entry path of .50 caliber rounds that should not have been able to penetrate. Officers tried to explain the losses as tactical misfortune. But no amount of discipline could erase what the men had seen. These weren't anomalies. They were physics. Prisoners captured after bailing out from burning vehicles told interrogators the same story. "We thought you had developed a secret weapon." They refused to believe the Americans were firing ordinary heavy machine guns. When interrogators showed them the Browning M2, just a tripod-mounted gun with a thick barrel, the tankers stared in horror. It wasn't special, it was standard. Even worse was the realization that American abundance meant these tank-killing weapons were everywhere. Mounted on jeeps, half-tracks, landing craft, tank turrets, sometimes even set up on sandbags with fields of fire overlapping like a deadly chessboard. Japanese crews learned quickly there was no safe angle. Side armor? Pierced completely. Rear engine deck? Riddled. Even turret plates offered no sanctuary. This reality seeped through Japanese lines like poison. On later islands, tank commanders hesitated before counterattacking. They ordered their crews to move only at night, to hide behind ridges, to bury tanks in sand like pillboxes. Anything to avoid the terrifying sight of glowing .50 caliber tracers stitching toward them. Some tankers wrote in diaries recovered after the war, "Our armor is paper. Our cannons are toys." Others confessed dread every time they heard the deep thumping report of a Browning somewhere in the distance. Worse still, they now understood American tanks were not simply stronger. They were supported by radios coordinating artillery, aircraft, bazookas, mines, and naval gunfire. Japan had brought knives to a gunfight, then discovered the enemy was building guns faster than they could swing. Morale didn't just sag, it shattered. The myth of Japanese armored superiority died on Saipan, exposed by mathematics and metallurgy. For the first time, tank crews realized they were climbing into steel boxes that could not protect them. They marched toward battle, knowing the outcome. And in World War II, nothing attacked the human spirit more brutally than hopelessness. While Japanese tankers wrestled with despair, the United States was doing something Japan simply could not match: mass-producing war. In Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York, assembly lines longer than city blocks clanged day and night, spitting out steel giants with mechanical precision. 1 month of production at the Detroit Arsenal gave America more tanks than Japan could build in a year. Inside these factories, overhead cranes swung turret hulls like toys. Conveyor belts rolled tracks past workers who welded, riveted, painted, and wired with practiced confidence. As men shipped off to the front, women stepped forward, transforming into industrial warriors, rosies with torches, pounding rivets into armor plate, installing engines the size of small cars. They weren't just building machines, they were building survival. Engineers constantly refined designs. Armor thickness improved. Shell storage moved to wet racks to prevent explosions. Radios were upgraded. Sights became clearer. Optics sharpened. And most importantly, the improvements showed up fast. If a Sherman fought poorly in Italy, a better version reached France months later. Japan had no such luxury. Its factories were small, vulnerable to bombing, starved of steel and fuel. Raw materials trickled through submarine-infested waters. Engineers sketched new tank prototypes, the Type 3 Chi-Nu, the Type 4 Chi-Tu, but production lines remained theoretical. By the time better armor existed, it wasn't numbers on paper Japan needed. It was hundreds of tanks rolling off lines every month, something the empire could never deliver. Worse yet, American logistics worked like arteries. Spare parts flowed like blood. Damaged Shermans returned to battle within days. A Japanese tank crippled on Saipan? It stayed where it died, rusting, burning, or buried in ash. To Japanese soldiers on the ground, The war began to feel rigged, not by fate, but by factories. The realization that industry itself could be a weapon hit harder than shrapnel. Japan wasn't just losing battles. It was losing the capacity to fight battles. Saipan hammered that truth home. No matter how courageous a tanker was, courage can't thicken armor. America wasn't just winning. It was outbuilding every nation on Earth. And that was a battlefield Japan could never conquer. As the Pacific War dragged on, Japanese commanders stopped pretending their tanks could maneuver in the open. On island after island, armored units changed roles. Instead of charging, they were buried, literally. In volcanic rock, coral sand, and black ash, crews dug pits deep enough to sink their tanks up to the turret rings. From a distance, they looked like bunkers. In truth, they were dead machines waiting to die slowly. On Iwo Jima, tanks lay hidden like metal teeth in the ground, their guns sticking out like jaws. When Americans advanced, they awakened, firing a few shells before vanishing into smoke. But once discovered, flamethrower tanks rolled forward, bathing turrets in liquid fire until vision slits dripped like melted candles. Hatches erupted as desperate crews clawed to escape, only to find riflemen waiting. On Peleliu, some tanks fired from cave mouths, their hulls swallowed by limestone. Bomb blasts shook the rock, clogging barrels with dust, turning every shot into a gamble. Meanwhile, Marines learned that a simple tactic worked best. Aim the .50 caliber at the turret ring. When rounds penetrated, the inside bloomed with fragments. Bolts, gears, and metal teeth turned into shrapnel as deadly as any grenade. By Okinawa, tankers rarely climbed inside at all. They were told to use their vehicles as fixed guns, never move, never charge. Morale eroded. Crews slept knowing their fort could become an oven if a flamethrower got within 10 yards. Even in the war's final days, Japan dug tanks into the soil around Tokyo Bay, creating a defensive ring that would never fire a shot. The empire surrendered, but the tanks waited, silent, buried, rusting monuments to outdated doctrine. Not one of those machines ever met an American Sherman in open terrain. Not one turned the tide. They were tombs, temporary shelters delaying an inevitable end. For the tankers inside, there was no glory, just heat, smoke, and steel slowly cooking in Pacific sun. Their machines had become coffins. Their tactics had become survival plans. Saipan had shown the truth. Japanese armor no longer maneuvered in battle. It only waited to die. When the battle for Saipan ended, the landscape looked like a scrapyard of burned hulls and twisted tracks. Marines walked past Type 95 tanks now frozen in the positions where they died. Armor peeled open by .50 caliber rounds like tin cans. For the Japanese survivors, the truth was final. Bravery could not thicken steel, and faith could not outrun industrial reality. Their tanks weren't just defeated, they were obsolete the moment they landed. Reports spread across the Pacific, and American troops carried a simple rule into every island fight. If a Japanese tank appeared, bring the Browning forward and fire. Confidence replaced fear. By war's end, Japanese armor no longer symbolized strength. It represented the tragic consequences of fighting modern war with yesterday's machines. Saipan didn't just destroy tanks. It shattered an illusion, showing that in World War II, industry, engineering, and production win wars long before men meet on the battlefield.